Hi there, welcome. This is the Kelly's Astrology podcast, where you can find insight, guidance, and understanding through astrology. I'm Kelly, and I'll be your host.
Hey there, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Kelly's Astrology podcast. This week's show is about taking a little look into the year ahead. It's the start of November. We're getting close to the end of the year, and many of you are probably starting to think about what 2026 might hold. How will the astrology be different then from now? Will it be the same? And there are lots of different ways to explore timing for the year ahead in astrology. So in today's show, I'm going to share about two key aspects that are going to form in 2026. I'll share some tips on what to expect, a little bit about how to work with them, and we'll put into kind of context the aspects that are happening in 2026 and how they might link to 2025 or beyond into 2027. So we're going to talk about two aspects involving those more outer planet, major planets for the year ahead. Those aspects include Saturn conjunct Neptune, which will happen in Aries. And we also have Uranus trine Pluto. So Uranus in Gemini, trine Pluto in Aquarius. So they're the two aspects that I want to spend a little time on in today's show. Now, separate to what I'm talking about today, which is kind of like a bird's eye overview in terms of these major themes for the year ahead. If you are looking for more of perhaps a deep dive into your personal chart for the year ahead, I hope you'll join my upcoming live course, which is all about how to plan your year ahead for 2026. In it, I'm going to teach you how to work with perfections and with transits in your personal chart so that you can explore whatever special timing cycles are active for you in the year ahead. If you'd like more details or you're ready to register, pop over to kellysastrology.com. Okay, so as we dive into these aspects today, I want you to keep in mind that we are taking that kind of bird's eye view of the year ahead, that some of what's going on in your personal chart might be different to what I'm talking about today. And that's what we'd be covering in the course. So if you're really interested in your personal astrology for 2026, do go and check out my Plan Your Year Ahead 2026 course. However, even just taking this bird's eye view over the year ahead, 2026, I think you're going to notice some really interesting themes and topics. And at the end of the episode, or towards the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can kind of anchor these major aspects into your personal chart and some of the ways that you could think about them from a personal perspective. So there's lots to look at, so let's dive in. I mentioned that our first aspect is going to be Saturn conjunct Neptune, which is happening at 0 Aries. It is activating the fire element with Saturn and Neptune in fire signs. And Saturn and Neptune will come to their exact conjunction on the 20th of February, 2026. Now, you have probably already heard a little bit, or maybe a lot, about Saturn conjunct Neptune, as this aspect got very, very close in August of 2025. At that time, Saturn and Neptune were both around 1 degree of Aries. They didn't technically make their exact conjunction, but they were close enough that we were definitely feeling Saturn and Neptune vibes. So when we talk about the Saturn conjunct Neptune aspect occurring in February of 2026, we do have a specific date where the aspect becomes exact to the minute. But we also know that Saturn and Neptune are slower moving planets. And so even though we're saying February of 2026, we know that that energy was active kind of July, August, September 25. And the Saturn-Neptune aspect that's exact in February is definitely going to have lingering effects into March and probably a little bit beyond as well. So just to understand that these aspects, because they're bringing together slower moving planets, it's not just one day that the aspect is influential, that it is a period of time. Okay, so we've got those technical pieces out of the way. And so Saturn and Neptune, if we want to understand a little bit about their cycle, they form a conjunction every 35 to 37 years. And the last few times that Saturn and Neptune have come to form a conjunction, let me take you through them. The last Saturn-Neptune conjunction was in 1989 when both planets were in Capricorn. The one before that was 1952-1953 when Saturn and Neptune were in Libra. And the one prior to that was in 1917 when Saturn and Neptune were together in early Leo. So they are just some historical dates to give you when we've had previous Saturn-Neptune conjunctions. If you are a history buff, you might enjoy reviewing major events from those periods in time, or even developments around agreements and alliances that either formed or that came apart at those points in history. So now we're starting to get into what is Saturn conjunct Neptune all about. So we have these themes, this interplay between what is real and what is not real, what is fact versus what is fantasy. Saturn is the planet that is very fact-based. Saturn is looking for this grounded kind of clarity about what is real, what is tangible. Neptune is a planet that has that illusory quality. It brings in the element of imagination, that idea of, drawing on the divine, pulling through energy. And certainly with Neptune, we are in the realm of intuition or with energy. So Saturn and Neptune coming together historically has been really interesting in terms of bringing forward new forms of energy, new technologies that are about energy production or about the creation, the transport, the use of different kinds of energy. So that's something to keep in mind. But with Saturn-Neptune, we also have this sense of what is real. And what we're getting with Saturn-Neptune, with Neptune as kind of the dominant archetype here, we have this sense that there is a dissolving quality. That structures, either physical, tangible structures or systems that have underpinned the foundations of our lives, like systems in society, for instance, they are kind of dissolving or they are morphing from what they have been into something new. And that transition period is often a very temporary but very real period of confusion or uncertainty. With Saturn and Neptune, we don't have clarity about what's real, what's solid, what's reliable. We're dealing with heightened levels of uncertainty, which can bring worry and, in therapeutic terms, that tendency to catastrophize. Oh my gosh, things aren't so great. What if it gets worse? That idea of worrying about, things getting worse than what they might be now. So this is all part of Saturn-Neptune. And the key thing we want to remember is that we're really unclear as to what's real and what's not, this idea of real versus not real. So we've talked about this idea of softening of structures or the dissolving energy. So boundaries and borders become very blurred, or there is a lot of moving with boundaries and borders. It used to be here, now it's here. We haven't maintained the fence, so to speak, and so the fence has fallen down. So where is the boundary line meant to be exactly? And that confusion around limits and around defining criteria is also something that's very much a part of Saturn conjunct Neptune. When we bring in the more spiritual element here, we have this quality of how do we embody energetic awareness, or how do we make tangible the intangible or mystical realms? So we're kind of exploring what are the limits of our imagination? Are there limits in our imagination or not? How do we balance, that sense of our body as a physical thing versus an understanding of our body as an energetic vehicle as well? So this idea about embodying our spirituality or cultivating devotional practices to non-physical forms can also come up with Saturn-Neptune. A question that you might be mulling over under Saturn conjunct Neptune can be around what is the purpose of dreams and imagination in a world that is bound by reality, form, and reason. So there may be a growing appreciation of the place, the purpose, even the power of imagination. But there is a little bit of a tussle between focusing on what's tangible, what's solid, what is explainable, versus exploring what is this kind of unknowable, intangible realm. That's part of what we can be exploring. When we are in a Saturn conjunct Neptune time in our lives, in history, we can feel like there is a loss of what has been stable, familiar, or enduring. That the things we've relied on, or the things that we've just kind of assumed would continue. These are the things associated with Saturn. They're the things that we are feeling that they're not stable anymore. So maybe you've always expected that certain things would happen socially or culturally or in terms of government organizations. And now you're realizing, oh, I just thought it would always keep going, and that's no guarantee. So sometimes in a Saturn conjunct Neptune time that we're in, which we could say at its strongest would be mid-2025 through to about April of 2026, this can be a time where there is this sort of washing away of old forms and structures and habits and patterns so that we can build more compassionate structures, or we can build systems that have perhaps a more soulful or respectful quality. So the piece that we're in at the moment with the Saturn conjunct Neptune, we're kind of between two strong expressions of this. This is the time of peak uncertainty where the old is washing away, but we don't know what new is going to come in yet. And the image that I have a lot for Saturn Neptune is the idea for any of you who've ever played with young children, or you were a young child playing on the seashore, at the ocean, and you would build a sandcastle and you dig holes and a big wave would come in and wash away everything that you had built. And because you're a young child, you just start again. But it's that kind of image. And the things that have been built up over the last 35, 37 years. So the last 3 or more decades. And those programs in society, or those systems and structures, maybe it's a banking system, maybe it is a support system, maybe it's a food distribution system, they are all not as reliable or consistent as they have been in the past. Now, Saturn and Neptune are meeting in the sign of Aries. We talked about energy. So resources that are required for energy production, that's where we're going to see things being not consistent and not stable, particularly with this Saturn-Neptune in Aries. So hopefully that's giving you a sense of this conjunction. It is definitely about this idea of like a flood or a high tide coming in and washing away what we've built up. And if any of you who have ever been present in the aftermath of a flood, there is a lot of cleanup and drying out required. And once we get to the middle part of 2026, that's where what we're in. It's like the cleanup after the flood, but we're kind of in this heightened sense of symbolically water kind of flooding everyone. And so that idea of maybe being overwhelmed, feeling unclear, dealing with higher levels of uncertainty, maybe surrendering to higher powers or divine sources. I can't control those things. I can manage this, and we're just going to have to do the best we can. That's sometimes all we can do. The other thing with Saturn Neptune in a fire sign is we are kind of being invited to create a new vision for the future. So the idea is that with the flood is coming in, we've got to let go of perhaps what we have been building or what we have created. And instead, we're being invited, especially because this Saturn-Neptune conjunction is at 0 degrees of Aries, the very beginning of the zodiac, the place of seeding and intentions, and that place of kind of initiation, if you like, that birth or beginning. So we're invited to explore new visions and new dreams. We're kind of surrendering the perception of safety or familiarity that was perhaps attached to our past habits or structures and forms. And we're thinking about, if that's all being washed away, what could we imagine that might be brighter or more sustainable for the future from this place? So we really do need to think about a new dream for the future with Saturn conjunct Neptune. There's a beautiful quote that I've really been mulling over about the longer Neptune in Aries transit that may be a little bit relevant as we think about this Saturn-Neptune conjunction in February of 2026. It's by an American writer, Anne Lamott, and this quote says, "Lighthouses don't go running all over an island looking for boats to save. They just stand there shining." And I kind of like this quote because it's a clue that part of the mission that we're all perhaps called towards, that we're really getting clear on under this Saturn-Neptune conjunction, is how can I most genuinely shine my most authentic light out into the world? So when you're thinking about what forms or structures you might want to let go of and what new ones you want to build, you could think about what is going to best support me in my unique journey to express my individual light, talent, gifts, or passions out in the world at large. Okay, so with that said, let's turn our attention to thinking about the second big aspect that is kicking in 2026, and this is Uranus trine Pluto. So here we have Uranus kind of settling into Gemini and making a trine aspect with Pluto, which is now firmly ensconced in early Aquarius. So these two planets are activating the air element, which is different from the fire element that Saturn-Neptune is emphasizing. Now, with Uranus trine Pluto, there's a couple of things we want to talk about here. Technically, this aspect will form 3 times over a 12-month period. So the first exact Uranus trine Pluto aspect is July of 2026 from 4 Gemini to 4 Aquarius. In November of 2026, we have a second trine, Uranus now at 3 Gemini, Pluto at 3 Aquarius. And then the third and final exact Uranus trine Pluto aspect is June of 2027. And this is Uranus at 6 Gemini with Pluto at 6 Aquarius. I know some of you really love the degrees and details, but I think it's important that we all get the dates there. So first Uranus trine Pluto aspect is exact July 26, second in November of 26, and the third in June of 27. So we can see this is a pattern that is very strong off and on from mid-26 to mid-2027. Now, this is another aspect that you might have heard a little bit about already as well, because Uranus came very close to making that aspect with Pluto in August, September, and early October of 2025. So we have just had a period of time that's had a lot of these emanations of Uranus-Pluto in it. But in terms of the full strength of this aspect, that really comes forward starting in mid-2026. Now, this is an interesting aspect for a number of reasons. It does amplify the longer air elemental era, which is something that began in December of 2020. It is a much longer cycle, something like 150 plus years. And so we have entered a new era in development, which happened at the end of 2020, which is why things do feel really different now to what they felt like before. And this has to do with the great conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn, which is an older timing technique that has been very popular throughout periods in astrology's history around timing these more kind of epoch shifts. So in end of 2020, we came into this air elemental era, and now we have 2 major planets, Uranus and Pluto, aspecting each other across air signs. Now, this does emphasize all kinds of air element things as a starting point. Innovation, technology, science, robotics, space and air travel. The way that we've seen space and air travel develop in previous major air elemental eras or previous cycles of Pluto in Aquarius, for instance, we know that there is still more to come in this cycle. So Pluto's doing its thing in Aquarius, and now Uranus is really speeding up the pace of change and innovation and experimentation. So with Uranus Pluto, we do get this revolutionary and rebellious quality that does have a lot of change for society and culture. We have a lot of discoveries in a variety of industries. We're having breakthroughs. We're having that pattern breaking energy of Uranus. We're not doing things the way we've done them anymore. So Uranus trine Pluto is quite a radical realignment of the fabric of society. And so this sense of a lot happening really quickly is very real. And this Uranus Pluto aspect is a big part of that. So fast-paced inventions, advances, and changes with people and with technology and how we're using technology. When we have this strong air elemental emphasis, which is sort of exacerbated by Uranus Pluto, we get a lot of movement. We get fragmentation. We get this idea of the dispersal of power centers or the dispersal of established centers of power. Alliances come apart and are reformed in new and different ways. So society, community, connection all start to look very different. And initially, this can feel very unsettling because it feels a bit like you're in a brave new world and nothing is like what it was before. And we know that's part of having Uranus in the mix, which is about breaking new ground and pushing forward into uncharted territory. We know that Uranus is a lot about challenging the status quo, breaking with the traditions of the past. It's no longer about enduring rituals or preserving what has been. It's about building something new for the future. So with Uranus, particularly in Gemini, trine Pluto, we have this sort of quote or this feeling, that it's curiosity that is leading the way forward rather than tradition or habit. So this idea of trying new things, it's very experimental. What works, what doesn't? We really don't know until we try. And that's, again, an element of diving into the unknown. Will this experiment work? Will it kind of blow up in our faces? We don't know until we give it a shot. At a very simple personal level, you're really going to want to think about maybe facing fears. Uranus to Pluto is what has had a hold over us and how can we reclaim our autonomy, our identity, or our individuality in that. So facing some fears, pushing back on patterns that are long established in our own lives. And a saying that you often hear about, particularly interestingly enough, with tech companies, is this idea of move fast and break things. And it's not that I want us all to break things that are important to us, but this idea of not being attached to the way things are now feels really important with Uranus trine Pluto. Going further at this idea at a personal level, Uranus trine Pluto really indicates a lot of shakeups around power and control. It might be indicating a more egalitarian approach to power or influence, or even this idea of why do we need to have dominance? Why can't we make it more collaborative? Why can't we have more of a collective approach? Particularly given that Pluto is in Aquarius, that kind of approach on behalf of the collective or the group seems really relevant. We're going to be exploring new expressions of authenticity. So each of us is exploring, what does freedom mean to me? What does autonomy mean to me? How can I create that in a world that is changing so quickly that it seems so unfamiliar? And the idea here is about making your own way forward rather than following an established path. And we're even seeing this a little bit with younger generations and conversations about younger generations not being able to do all the things that their parents or grandparents might have done. So the idea of not following in the footsteps of what people might have done for life choices or financial choices over the last number of decades, but instead thinking about how could we find a new way, a new rhythm, a new focus, a new set of intentions for going forward from here. Uranus-Pluto combinations can be very freeing. They are often about helping particularly groups of people in society that are suppressed or marginalized to have more of a say or to have more of, to be more included perhaps. like a really dramatic Uranus-Pluto combination that was in relatively recent history, although it's still going back a few decades, was in the 1960s when we had a Uranus-Pluto conjunction in Virgo. And we had the rise of a lot of social justice, racial justice, and feminist themes coming forward, where we had a lot of that women's liberation movement happening. And so when we do get Uranus-Pluto combinations, and technically speaking, the one we're having second half of 26, first half of 27 is, dare I say, a more gentle version of Uranus-Pluto because it's a trine rather than a conjunction, a square, or an opposition. So it's not as intense as some Uranus-Pluto combinations can be, but nonetheless, it still is bringing those rumbles through in terms of changing, or that kind of, almost like the earthquake underneath. And because Uranus-Pluto is happening in these air signs, the rumbles are being felt in the interpersonal space around human experience, human relationship, and human development, because air signs are all associated with that. Air signs, of course, also connected to technology. So the interaction between fast-paced development of technology and, human development and human behavior, and what works well and what is really disruptive that we might need to rein in. So there's a lot of new ideas to come about how we could better exist in this time, in this day and age that we're in. So Uranus-Pluto has this theme for freedom. How do we create a more empowering sort of approach where there is more freedom of choice? Now, that can feel very unsettling or unstable initially. If everything is going through a period of upheaval, we don't have a sense of what is going to be the same tomorrow as it was yesterday. So collectively, Uranus-Pluto certainly looks like radical and fast-paced social change, societal change. We have new values and new ideas about how communities and societies should work together. I know there's a lot of big ideas there. One of the simple ways that I think a lot about major Uranus aspects like this is about pattern breaking. So it's about changing the way you've always done things. I'm going to share a little bit of a personal story towards the end of today's episode about how I'm already seeing this in my own life. Before I do, I want to give you my quote for this Uranus-Pluto aspect. And it's a quote that I actually use a lot for Uranus transits for clients. It's by another American writer, Barbara Kingsolver. And the quote, it's from a book called How to Fly, which I think is very relevant with Uranus, Pluto, air signs, and, space and air travel and things like that. So the quote says, "Behold your elements reassembled as pieces of sky, ascending without regret, for you've been lucky enough. Imagine your joy on rising. Repeat as necessary." And I really like this quote. There's a reference to the sky. So this idea of kind of the ether or the air, the space out there. But I also like this idea of our elements being reassembled, because in particularly Uranus-Pluto combinations, it feels like all of the inside stuff in each of us is kind of pulled apart, separated out, maybe shaken up, and it comes back together in a totally new way. It's unfamiliar. There's an excitement about discovery, but there can also be a sense of, we've got to leave that behind. But I love that the quote moves towards this idea of imagining your joy on rising. It's possible that after the reassembling, there may be some joy about what arises from that. So that's a nice quote I wanted to share with you on that. Okay, so we've talked about some big ideas and big concepts. Instead of looking at like week ahead astrology or a full moon coming up, I wanted to start planting the seed about some of the kind of big visionary kind of new idea energy that is going to start rolling through in 2026. And there is so much more to be said about 2026 in terms of what's retrograde and where the eclipses are and what Saturn is doing when it's not connecting with Neptune, what will Jupiter be doing, et cetera, et cetera. But from this sort of top-down bird's eye view, these two aspects stand out as really important in the shape and feel of the year ahead that will be 2026, because each of these aspects brings together two of the major planets in a special or more unique kind of pattern. So that's kind of the big picture piece. let's talk a little bit about how you could think about these aspects in the context of your personal chart. And this is where I'm going to share a little bit of a story about how I'm seeing this showing up in my chart and life already. So first up, you might like to think about the houses in your chart that are going to host these aspects. For instance, thinking about the Aries house in your chart and the Saturn Neptune topics or themes of that aspect influencing your approach or kind of driving you towards a new strategy around the topics of the Aries house, the Aries part of your chart and life. You could think about your Gemini and Aquarius houses and the topics they're connected to, and those areas of your life hosting that Uranus trine Pluto aspect. So as you do that, you might be considering, if we think about the Aries part of your chart, you might consider, what are the old dreams about this part of my life that I maybe need to surrender or release, that I need to not hold on to so tightly anymore? And we could think about this Saturn-Neptune kind of meeting at 0 Aries as an invitation for you to dream up a new vision around the Aries part of your chart and life. What is a new dream or a new fantasy that you might want to hold as inspiration for the future based on these changing themes? If you think about the topics of the Gemini and Aquarius parts of your chart and life, you might think, how could I shake up my patterns or traditions or habits around these areas of life? And it occurred to me as I was, putting my notes together for this show, the air signs have a link to the 4th house in my personal chart, home and family, kind of family tradition or family patterns. And there is already a decision that has been made about a change to do with family gatherings. This is about how, many of you longtime listeners know my husband and I live in Canada. I'm Australian. We go back home on a regular basis. And the pattern that we have followed for our going back to Australia trips, which is like a going home trip for me, we made a decision that this year is going to be the last year we keep up with that pattern. We want to kind of free ourselves from doing that thing at that time of year and always going to Australia, at the time of year we go. And part of the reason for doing that is just wanting a little bit more flexibility so that we could go to Australia at other times of year and that we could go and do other things at the time of year we normally go to Australia. So we've got one more year, like one more visit. So we'll be, going to Australia again on that pattern, just one more. And by the time we get into 2026, we have got a new kind of more spacious approach that we're looking at. And so I can already see how this aspect has led or helped contribute to this decision being made. And I share that because it does mean that I'm going to be changing a pattern that's been in play for many years about family. And I know that's often not what we think about, but when I think about Uranus transits particularly, I think a lot about the pattern breaking and the changing of long established habits and routines and rituals. And with Pluto in the mix, there's something about maybe a more empowering choice or claiming and using the power that you have. And so I share that story about changing my own rhythms and patterns, or the intention to do that starting in 2026 with family, because I hope that that inspires you to shake up and explore a more authentic or kind of updated, fresh approach to the topics of your Gemini and Aquarius houses. So hopefully that gets you thinking. If you would like some support on planning your 2026 with astrology, I hope to see you in my Plan Your Year Ahead course. We start November 10th and details are over at kellysastrology.com. I would love to hear your thoughts on these aspects happening in 2026. Particularly, I'm interested in anything that you might be ready to shake up based on that Uranus-Pluto transit. Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for joining me for today's show. I look forward to seeing you again real soon. Until then, take care.